Welcome to The Explainer. Today we've got an absolutely fascinating journey ahead of us. We're going to unpack a profoundly ancient document, Psalm 56. But listen, we aren't just going to read this as some dusty historical text. No, we're going to break it down as a highly structured, almost psychological roadmap for processing intense fear, opposition, and anxiety. If you've ever felt completely overwhelmed by your circumstances, just backed into a corner, well, the text we're analyzing today offers this incredible blueprint for resilience.
To really grasp the weight of this, I want you to ask yourself something. What actually goes through your mind when you are surrounded, trapped, and completely out of options? Think about that visceral, physical reaction for a second. That sudden spike in your heart rate, the immediate tunnel vision, that suffocating feeling of the walls just closing in on you. Today, we're going to look at how an ancient author navigated exactly that kind of cornered, desperate reality and the specific mental steps they took to survive it. To understand this blueprint properly, we really have to understand the crisis that triggered it. So let's look at Section 1, Captured in Enemy Territory. Okay, let's dive into this. The exact superscription, which is the introductory text directly from our source, explicitly says, "A Michtam of David, when the Philistines seized him in Gath." This is absolutely crucial, guys, because it tells us right away that this isn't some theoretical exercise in dealing with anxiety. The author, David, is physically captured. He has been seized in Gath, which historically was deep in enemy territory. It was literally the hometown of his greatest enemies. He is entirely surrounded by people who want him dead. So the stakes literally could not be higher here. This is a moment of imminent, mortal danger. But right alongside that terrifying historical context of being captured, there's this specific instruction that precedes it. It says, the text is to be directed to the choir master according to the dove on far-off terebinths. Now, our source text notes this is likely a musical or liturgical term. Just imagine that for a second. Against a backdrop of sheer terror, physical capture, and a very real threat to his life, there is this incredibly delicate, poetic instruction for how this song should be arranged and sung. It creates this stunning contrast right out of the gate, the harsh reality of his situation up against the intentional, structured art he's using to process it. So, zooming out from that specific historical crisis, let's break down the universal psychological toll this takes on the human mind in Section 2, The Anatomy of Fear. In the opening verses, the author vividly maps out this claustrophobic, terrifying reality. He fires off a rapid-fire list of verbs from verses 1 through 6, describing an attacker who tramples on him and oppresses him. There's a real, heavy physical weight to being trampled. He says they attack proudly, but crucially, notice the nuance here. The text says they injure my cause. Our source footnote actually clarifies that this can also be translated as they twist my words, so it's deeply psychological too. Their thoughts are constantly against him for evil, they stir up strife, they lurk, and they watch his every step, just waiting to take his life. It's a portrait of total, suffocating paranoia where every single movement is monitored by hostility. And, it isn't just the sheer intensity of these attacks, it's the duration that really breaks the human spirit. The author emphasizes this exhausting repetition with one specific phrase, all day long. He uses this exact phrase in verses 1, 2, and 5. He's describing a nonstop psychological siege. There is no break, there is no relief, and there is literally nowhere to hide. It's an exhausting, repetitive trauma that simply does not end. But right at the moment when you'd expect the fear to completely overwhelm the author and break him, we see a massive, intentional shift. Section 3, Choosing Trust over Terror. This brings us to a really profound emotional pivot point in verse 3. He says, "When I am afraid, I put my trust in you." I want you to think of this as a deliberate cognitive behavioral interruption. He doesn't deny the fear. He doesn't pretend he isn't terrified. He openly admits, when I am afraid, totally acknowledging the absolute reality of his terror. But, and this is the key, he actively interrupts that downward fear spiral by making a highly conscious choice to pivot his focus. He's forcing his mind to shift gears. So the really crucial point here is how he mentally reframes this threat. Consider the contrast. On one side, he evaluates the mortal threat, asking this rhetorical question, what can flesh, or as verse 11 says, what can man do to me? And he weighs that directly against his divine anchor. In God I trust. I shall not be afraid. The author intentionally repeats this exact refrain in verses 4, 10, and 11 to ground himself. He's contrasting the finite, limited fear of mortal man with the infinite, boundless power of his protector. By repeating it, he is actually training his brain to focus on the anchor rather than the storm. This active internal processing of his trauma leads us to what is arguably one of the most striking and beautiful metaphors in all of ancient literature. Section 4. Tears in a Bottle.
Verse 8 is just incredibly moving. The author writes, "You have kept count of my tossings, put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book?" It's definitely worth noting here that our text's footnote clarifies that tossings can also be accurately translated as wanderings. The imagery here is just haunting. He's asking his divine protector to literally collect his grief, to account for every single sleepless night, every anxious tossing and turning, and every moment of isolated wandering.
To fully grasp why that verse is so powerful, we can actually look at the modern psychological concept of validation. Validation is the recognition and acceptance of another person's internal experience as valid and understandable. That ancient tears in a bottle imagery perfectly encapsulates this deep human psychological need. It's the ultimate expression of wanting to feel seen and validated in our suffering. The author finds comfort in the belief that not a single tear is wasted, forgotten, or overlooked. His pain is recorded in a book. His suffering actually matters. Because his trauma has been processed and validated, the author doesn't stay trapped in the darkness of his initial capture. We see a final transition as we move into Section 5, Walking the Light. And this brilliantly illustrates the complete upward trajectory of this text. We can clearly map out this journey of resilience. First, it requires calling out and actively choosing trust, as we saw in verses 3 and 9, trusting that God is for him. This active trust is exactly what leads to the ultimate result in verse 13. His soul is delivered from death, and his feet are kept from falling. And finally, it all culminates in step 3, a state of liberated gratitude where he can now walk before God in the light of life. He commits to performing his vows and rendering thank offerings. Think about it. He's gone from a state of paralyzing fear surrounded by enemies in Gath to a place of empowered, grateful living in the light. Which brings us to the end of our analysis, and it leaves us with a critical question to consider in our own lives. When you feel trampled, when the attacks feel relentless all day long and your words are being twisted, where do you anchor your trust? Psalm 56 offers a timeless, highly structured roadmap for all of us. It teaches us to honestly acknowledge the fear, to seek validation for our tears, but ultimately to actively choose to interrupt the fear spiral and trust the anchor that keeps our feet from falling.